Dungeon, Gaming's War on Birth. In The Binding of Isaac, one popular indie game from the last decade, you descend through increasingly disturbing levels. And here, in the later stages, you see them clearly labeled. The womb. The scarred womb. The game literally makes you fight your way through a womb. You shoot enemies that emerge from fleshy walls. You navigate passages designed to look like reproductive organs. You fight bosses with names like the blighted ovum. The place where human life begins, the womb, has been turned into a dungeon you must conquer. This isn't metaphor. This isn't symbolism. The developers explicitly name it the womb and design it to look exactly like what you think. Why? FreesFramed. Part 1. The Dungeon That Should Be Sacred. For thousands of years, the womb has been understood as sacred space, the place where life forms, where souls enter mortality, where humanity itself is sustained generation after generation. Even the word itself, womb, carries connotations of warmth, safety, nurturing. It's where we all began. Modern horror gaming has taken this sacred space and turned it into a hostile environment, not just scary, actively antagonistic to your survival. Let's examine how deeply this goes. Part 2. The Binding of Isaac's Reproductive Horror. The Binding of Isaac is brutal in its honesty about what it's doing. The game doesn't hide behind metaphor. It names the levels after reproductive anatomy and designs them to match. You descend from the basement, through the caves, through the depths, and eventually into the womb and the scarred womb. The visual design shifts from stone and dirt to flesh, blood vessels, and organic matter. The bosses you fight here, names that make the intent unmistakable, like the blighted ovum, a medical term for a failed pregnancy. You're literally fighting reproductive failure as a monster. And notice, the game frames this as descent. You go down into the womb. It's not portrayed as elevation or transcendence or life-giving. It's the depths you must overcome to reach the true ending. Edmund Macmillan, the creator, has been open about the game exploring dark religious themes and childhood trauma. But why specifically make the womb the battleground? Why turn the space of creation into a space of combat? Part 3. Silent Hill's Forced Birth. Silent Hill 3 takes this a step further. The protagonist, Heather, has been chosen, without her consent, to birth a god. Throughout the game, you learn that a cult has implanted something inside her. She is pregnant with their deity, whether she wants to be or not. Near the end of the game, there's a scene where Heather, realizing what's been done to her, expels the unwanted entity from her body. The developers at Team Silent could have handled this through implication, through text, through lore discovered in documents. The way Shadow Man conveys its dark mythology through in-game books rather than graphic depiction. Instead, they chose to show it, in graphic detail. A young woman vomiting up a fetus while bile and blood pour from her mouth. There's no redemptive purpose in showing this. It's not necessary to understand the plot. It's not required to convey the horror of forced pregnancy. It's indulgence. The developers chose to depict something that should remain outside the bounds of entertainment. What message does this send? That the most graphic violation imaginable, the violent expulsion of unwanted pregnancy, is content to consume. The womb isn't just a dungeon here. It's a violation, a prison, something that must be purged. Part 4. Dead Space's Artificial Wombs. Dead Space presents a sci-fi version of the same horror. The necromorphs, the game's primary enemies, include creatures called lurkers, that are formed from embryos and unborn children harvested from artificial wombs. These creatures attack you with tentacles emerging from where their arms should be. They're literally weaponized fetuses. The game's lore explains they were created from the embryos in the colony ship's artificial gestation chambers. In Dead Space 2, you encounter crawlers, baby-based necromorphs that were once infants, now reanimated as explosive enemies that crawl towards you. The pattern is clear. Life at its beginning is a source of horror. These aren't adult corpses reanimated. These aren't animals mutated into monsters. These are specifically the unborn, embryos, fetuses, newborns, transformed into enemies you must destroy. And where do you find many of them? In areas designed to look like medical facilities, nurseries, gestation chambers. The spaces meant to nurture new life have become hunting grounds. Part 5. The environmental message. What connects all of these? They make the spaces of creation into spaces of destruction. The womb becomes a dungeon. The place of birth becomes a place of death. The nursery becomes a nightmare. The gestation chamber becomes a factory for horror. This is level design as philosophical statement. When game designers create the architecture you navigate, they're making choices about what spaces represent. Castles represent power and defense. Churches represent the sacred and profane. Laboratories represent knowledge and hubris. And increasingly, wombs represent horror. Think about what that does to players. You spend hours fighting through these environments. You learn to associate reproductive imagery with danger, with threat, with something that must be conquered and escaped. The place where you began, where everybody began, becomes the enemy territory. Part 6. What worldview builds this? So what philosophy creates games where the womb is a dungeon? I'd argue it's one where existence itself is seen as the problem. If coming into being is suffering, then the place where being begins must be hell. If life is a curse rather than a gift, then the womb is a prison rather than a sanctuary. This is antinatalism in environmental form. The level design itself preaches that it would have been better never to have been born. Contrast this with how healthy cultures view the spaces of birth. Birth rooms in traditional societies were treated as sacred. The places where women gave birth were considered holy ground, places where the divine and human met, where souls entered mortality. Even in our modern hospitals, we still try to make maternity wards welcoming, warm, life-affirming, because we instinctively understand that this space matters. But in gaming, the womb is where you go to fight for your life, where flesh itself becomes your enemy, where the very walls want you dead. Here's what I want you to consider. When game developers create these environments, when they model the fleshy walls, texture the organic matter, design the pulsing membranes, they're spending hundreds of hours making the womb disgusting. Teams of artists, designers, programmers, and directors collaborate to ensure that the space where human life begins triggers revulsion in players. That's not accidental. That's not just horror game aesthetics. That's a deliberate choice about what deserves to be made horrifying. And we accept it. We play through these levels, we fight the fetal monsters, we navigate the womb dungeons, and we're so desensitized to it that we don't even question why this specific imagery is used. What does it do to a culture when millions of young people spend hours learning to treat reproductive spaces as enemy territory? When the womb is framed not as a sanctuary, but as something to escape from? You are what you practice. And gaming teaches us to practice treating the spaces of creation as dungeons to conquer. Next time you descend into a fleshy, organic level in a horror game, freeze the frame. Ask, why is this space designed to look like a womb? What am I being taught about the places of creation? What philosophy turns the beginning of life into a dungeon? What else are you not noticing? Next episode, Dead Babies and Necromorph Theology. The final chapter examining what it means when death becomes the source of life in gaming narratives.
Freeze the frame. Find the truth.